With the recent visit of Premier Lee to Australia, there's been a lot of speculation about whether the relationship will improve or not, and many people have asked me for an opinion. So here it is. Wherever you are, welcome to my take on this very, very interesting topic, at least for me anyway. Just for some background, China's exports to Australia are currently 78 billion, and that's around 30+% of Australia's total imports. However, Australia exports more to China than it imports, and it's the only developed economy in the world to do so. And that's because Australia has an abundance of resources and relatively few people. China's total exports are 3.36 trillion, so Australia takes less than 2% and sends more than 30% of its exports. Australia's dependence on China is not only far greater, it's life-sustainingly critical to the Australian economy. China's reliance on Australia is almost negligible. The truth is, China could swat Australia away like a bug, but chooses not to. Australians should wonder why that is. And it isn't because they have the best iron ore. There is better iron ore in West Africa, and China is working with Rio Tinto, an Australian-based but predominantly US-owned and controlled mining company, to get it out. Note those words because they are important. Australian-based, but US-owned and controlled. And this is the problem. We should make no mistake about this. The USA has already invaded and occupied Australia. It was a friendly invasion, very surreptitious in nature, but comprehensive in execution. The USA controls Australia's intelligence community, defense capabilities, most of its economy, and much of its industry. And there are even people who believe the US controls the government. They most certainly influence it, if not control it. Whatever decisions Australia makes will be made in consultation, cooperation, or perhaps even with the permission of the USA. Now, to add to this, which was all done without the knowledge of most Australians, the US have achieved something else in Australia. Almost 100% misinformed media narrative about China, creating a sense in Australia that China is a threat, militarily, industrially, economically, and even at a local level societally, with stories they're buying all the houses and driving real estate prices out of reach. They are not, and they never were. Effectively, to use a mafia analogy, the US has created a fear of China, but now offers protection from that fear, not just for a fee, a high one, but for total submission. It's now virtually impossible for Australia to extricate itself from control of the USA. As John Mearsheimer pointed out at a Center for Independent Studies 4 years ago, you cannot choose to be China and America's friend. You can only choose one or the other. And he went on to say, you do not want to be America's enemy. If Australia chooses sides with China, they will become the enemy of America. So what if Australia decides it wants to go its own way? A few months ago, Wang Yi was in Australia, and a few days ago, Premier Lee was there too. Australians loved it because they believe China is sorry. China made mistakes. China's economy was impacted by their treatment of Australia in stopping some coal, some wine, lobsters, and barley. That cost 20 billion, or 3.36 trillion. China didn't come cap in hand to beg for forgiveness. That impression is understandable given the misinformation, but it's laughable to anyone who knows the facts. To China, this was a chance to improve relations, reduce tensions, help Australia to overcome this problem that it doesn't realize it actually has. Visa-free holidays were introduced, new pandas are going to be sent, climate agreements and education agreements were signed, many other positive things. But will it change anything? I personally think not much. The biggest threat to Australia doesn't come from China. It comes from US ownership, control of, or influence over many, perhaps even most, of Australia's largest companies, including the Big Four banks and many of the most important mining and resource companies. What American interests could do to Australia is actually beyond the comprehension of most Australians. Australia may believe it has the right to choose how it deals with China, The obvious choice is the most simple one. You rely on China for trade and the US for security. That's a great idea, but it's not so simple. Professor Warwick Powell has a great quote on this. China and Australia are in a bilateral relationship, but Australia has a trilateral partner, the USA. In other words, China would be happy to provide Australia with that choice as long as the security measures it has don't pose a threat. AUKUS poses no immediate threat to China. This may change in 10 or 15 years, but an AUKUS conclusion is extremely unlikely. By the time it comes around, there will have been several changes of government in both countries and therefore changes of policy. And who knows what changes of technology that will render nuclear submarines useless, perhaps. We don't know. Whatever AUKUS is today, it will not be what it will be by the time these subs are ready. Why would China worry about that? And whilst China might be happy to allow this trade and security choice, the US lives by a different code. Most likely, it wouldn't. For China, a multipolar world is possible. For the USA, as many commentators have echoed the words of Mearsheimer, there will be no peer competitors. Penny Wong calls the USA, quote, our closest ally and principal strategic partner, which would be great if they were a beneficial partner. But the US is a country born from a colony, the genocide of natives, the slavery of Africans, no respect for the rule of law, and one that has been at war for almost its entire history, with several of those wars started by proven lies. It's a country which has the highest degree of incarceration of its own people, and one which allows its citizens the right to shoot at each other. This can't be, in any normal world, a benevolent country. And given its history, if they don't get their own way, the US could instigate a war with Australia. They already have the troops and materials on the ground. But why would they? They've already invaded and they control Australia. Now Australia depends heavily on the US for regional security. It has a small military and has been encouraged to join the US in every major conflict since the Korean War. And now we know why. If they don't, the US might just walk away and abandon Australia. So some people would say, well, that's a good idea, but it isn't. The government of Australia sees such a high risk in China that they can't accept such a move. The risk is false. It's being created with a view to selling weapons and is, as the mafia analogy describes, and well written about by Charles Tilley, a protection racket. Unfortunately, Australia has a deep-seated fear of China, which can be traced back to the 1850s. The US has capitalized on this with a modern iteration. American influences in media, through politicians, through hundreds of think tank reports, even through academia and entertainment, have recreated a yellow peril. If the US were to threaten to pull out all military support, Australia is incapable of defending itself against any adversary. But despite all the talk, the adversary is not China. Some people view Indonesia as a threat too. This view was once again perpetuated by groups like ASPI. It appears to be a deliberate tactic designed to create a need to have the USA on the same side, protection. ASPI also have many articles on the growing and strengthening relationship with India, but it would be a foregone conclusion that if Australia aligns with China, its largest trading partner, the Lowy Institute points out that those positives would turn to negatives. Exactly the same applies to Japan. And again, ASPI and the like write glowingly of the relationship between Australia and Japan. And the US point out that choosing China over them would create a rift in the Quad. In other words, if you aren't with us, we're going to make sure those countries aren't with you either. So the truth is, without US protection, Indonesia, India, and Japan are all greater threats to Australia. Only one of these countries, India, has been caught with a nest of spies in Australia. Only one of these countries, Japan, has actually bombed and invaded Australia in the past. They also murdered thousands of innocent civilians and enslaved every white person they found in Asia. just 70 years ago. The other, Indonesia, has been involved with several conflicts with Australia, including militarily, the Indonesian-Malaysia conflict in the 60s, the East Timor crisis in the 90s, and the phone tapping scandal of 2013. Think about that. The three countries that have had military conflicts with Australia aren't on our radar as potential enemies, but the one that hasn't, the one that's always been allied with Australia, the largest trading partner, is actually considered a threat. Australian media talks of the dangers of Chinese ownership, but neglects to tell us that it's decreased. It was never more than 2%, 2% of foreign ownership, and the US has much deeper tentacles into Australia. In 2020, US investments in Australia totaled $984 billion, well over $1 trillion Australian dollars, approximately half of Australia's total GDP. The US owns significant and controlling interests in banking, retail, agriculture, communications. It has deep connections to Australia's defence. There are huge investments in the Australian Stock Exchange. Therefore, should they decide to do so, the US could simply shut down Australia. The US doesn't need to invade. It's already done that. But if they remove the military protection, we will see these supposed allies circling. If the US removed financial investments from Australia, the economy would collapse. People in governance who know this must be terrified. And that's why Australia does the bidding of the USA. It isn't because they want to, because they are, and quite rightly should be, very afraid of not doing so. So now when you ask yourself, why does the US control Australia? Why does Australia do what the US wants it to do? You know the answer. They've already been invaded. Thanks once again for watching my take, and please don't forget to check that subscribe button and give me a like if you enjoyed this. I will see you next time. Bye for now.